Hi, my name's Jordan, and today I'm going to be diving into the documentary Sandman, which was directed by J.T. Petty and a written piece titled Her Body Himself, Gender in the Slasher Film, written by Carol J. Clover. Some quick background: if you don't know what a slasher film, it's basically a bunch of usually teenagers who are being stalked and followed by someone masked or unknown who ends up murdering them for either no reason or there is a reason within the film. So, like, an example would be the Texas Chainsaw Massacres. So I'll be looking at that. Both of the pieces that I just mentioned are not horror in themselves, really. They're more so looking at the details of horror or analyzing its role in our society or why it's watched, because of the really gruesome acts that it displays. So, one of the main topics is the topic of sexual and arousal aspects of witnessing topics that are so taboo to the point where a lot of people who watch feel so uncomfortable that most people would just turn it off and not watch it, but to each their own. Some people enjoy this. And it's not like horror films are the first instance where you see humans being drawn to something so vile. I mean, if you look at countries or time periods where something like a public execution was taking place, there was a crowd, hence public execution. And it's as if humans they almost revel in the spectacle. So, while films that were studied in Sandman were disturbing, they had a large population submitting themselves to the heinous visuals. So, Sandman explores mainly snuff films and super underground, horrifying things that just can't be on the mainstream market. You're not going to find them on your local shelf or wherever. It's not going to happen. But while they were disturbing, they had a large population submitting themselves to the heinous visuals. In this case, though, unlike public executions, there's often some sort of sexual arousal and a lot of misogynistic feelings that lie behind the pleasure. So Clover, in the article, she puts it in a really interesting way, saying, and I quote, "But horror and pornography are the only two genres specifically devoted to the arousal of bodily sensations." So when you think about that, and then you combine both horror and pornography, it's something that is expected to have an audience. So in Sandman, the director dives into the genre of horror that's not on the mainstream market, like I said. Much more cruel and much more disturbing side of horror with independent filmmakers, like I said, making things such as snuff films, which are very gross. So in the beginning of the documentary, though, they're at a convention for films that can't be found in your local Walmart or Best Buy. And it's a convention for this, and there's a lot of people at the convention asking for their specific wants or desires to see on film. So it kind of proves the point that despite their taboo nature, these types of films do receive attention. There's an entire market for it. Which also leads to the idea that humans do have a side to them that enjoys being so up close to something so terrible, but not really needing to commit themselves to what is happening on the screen, because it's just that, it's happening on the screen. They have the ability to say, it's just a movie, this isn't happening physically directly in front of me. But people still revel in it. They still find some sort of pleasure in witnessing things that otherwise are not spoken about or seen. It's not an everyday encounter. It's just living in your subconscious, and you're there watching it, so you get to enjoy it because it's not real, and so on and so forth. I think a lot of the enjoyment also comes from one's own repressed desires, knowing that they can never act on such things, but being able to live through it by simply watching it. So, yeah, that can go for anything. It leads to another prominent topic in both of the pieces, which is misogyny. A good way to look at this is through the idea that women are constantly victims in horror films or the first to die. So when you look at a slasher film, I mean, it's like the oldest horror story in the book. There's always like the virgin dies first, so the girl is murdered. The girl virgin, never the guy virgin, dies first. And then there's always one girl left at the end, and she has to live with all this pain and remembering what she went through and seeing all of her friends murdered, so on and so forth. So it's super misogynistic, and the underground horror films are not much different. In every single film that the documentary displayed, there was either a woman being raped, tortured, or murdered in some fashion or another. And when they refer to women, they refer to them specifically as victims. Even in their casting, it's victim and killer, or victim, rapist, and so on. And it's always the girls. It's always the girls that are the victims and the men that are the murderers. It kind of reflects society's views on that. You rarely see women murderers or women being rapists, so it does reflect that. And even in the documentary, they are interviewing a girl, and she does a lot of work for, they're called B films amongst themselves, I guess. I had never heard that term. And she doesn't seem to specifically say that it seems to come from a misogynistic place, but she goes on to say that these films can actually help men who have been wronged by women and therefore are mad, or they have something bad happen, and watching these girls be abused and tortured is their way of having a release. So I find this interesting because it's clear hatred towards women if you find sexual pleasure in seeing them abused. And I think it tells an even larger story of society that it's the most prevalent form of snuff or underground film is women being abused, raped, tortured, etc. So on the other hand, though, I also think that for the girls who are playing these actresses, it could be very empowering. There's definitely a power, like the girl in the interview says, there's definitely power in giving the consent for these things to be done, whether it's having their legs and their hands tied up or being tied to a cross naked. It's them giving the consent to do those things. She does go on to say that some of the girls, or she believes some of the girls, have either been raped or have come close to being raped, and this is an outlet for them to take the power back, kind of take their control back and give consent and say yes. So it's a different dynamic. So even when you steer away from the underground films, which are so explicitly and clearly displaying misogyny and so on, the same still exists on the mainstream market, whether it's just on the mainstream market because it's less aggressive and portrayed in a more fiction way, deeming it more acceptable, but in reality, the same themes are still being tossed around. So, and then reading it gives examples of different movies where this happens. And Clover even gives a quote from someone who is considered to be a type of father to the horror genre, Alfred Hitchcock. He once said during filming Birds, I always believe in following the advice of the playwright Sarduo. He said, torture the women. The trouble today is that we don't torture enough women. And it's obviously a pretty disturbing quote, not only for what's implying needs to be done, but also for the fact that it's implying women are not tortured enough, which I can definitely argue against, especially in the world of horror. Like I said, it's always the woman is the victim. It's always the virgin being murdered first. The girl who pissed off the guy, or the group of girls who rejected this guy, and now he gets revenge by murdering them, and not having them have the ability to say no, something along those lines, like a slasher film. So you could also look at Hitchcock's Psycho and see the relationship, which Clover actually brings up Psycho. You see the relationship between gender and sexuality and the motive. So the villain of the story is super devoted to his mother, who actually ends up hating him, but he's still very devoted. That he becomes his mother and kills an innocent woman who he believes, when he is his mother, is displaying sexual attraction or affection to her son, even though it's him. So he has that idea. So it's hard to not put gender and sex in a category with horror when, like, a film like that, which is like the beginning, the birth of American horror almost, is such a prevalent topic. So the point remains that he struggles with his gender and becoming his mother, which could be for a source of comfort or arousal, depending on how you look at it. But the feeling being strong enough that he mentally becomes her, so that's a whole topic in itself. But it's also important to realize that, like, theme, gender, man and woman, sex is probably it's like the oldest theme in history of most genres, because it has the ability to play on the subconscious of things that already exist in an already existing population. So it's just playing on that. So it does grab attention. It's also, a quick side note, as far as these films go, putting a woman in the victim's position usually evokes more emotion, because people tend to feel more bad for the woman than they do for if it was a big, strong man, they would see the woman and feel bad for her, feel scared for her. And the man, they would be less scared, think he can handle it, along those lines, which I think is interesting, because then you're downplaying a woman's ability. But there's also, I guess, some sort of comfort in knowing that some people do feel bad for the woman. So I want to bring it back to my original idea that when you combine the two of horror and pornography, it does bring in an audience, and a very large one at that. And there's obviously exceptions to the presence of misogyny in horror, but the bigger point is that repressed feelings seen in horror evoke the biggest response, oftentimes a sexual one, because of repressed sexual feelings or feelings about gender or anything along those lines. So, thank you.